I am particularly excited to talk about this webinar, this index, because it's been one that Nicole and her team at the IMF created some years ago that really showed us in a way that we hadn't seen before, comparison of costs of vacation in the Caribbean compared to other global destinations. And now that they have updated it and enhanced the index, it's that much more exciting. So I'm very excited to share this data with everyone. Nothing like this exists anywhere else in the world as far as I'm aware. And given how important tourism is for us in the region, it is the single most important industry in this region. It's very important for us to understand these trends, what they mean, and what are the policy implications coming out from it. So let me introduce everyone else. So thank you again to everyone who's agreed to join the webinar. I have Nicole Laframboise, who is the IMF's Deputy Division Chief of the Western Hemisphere Department. Nicole also used to be the Mission Chief for Barbados at one point in time and for Grenada, and she's now the Mission Chief for Bolivia. So we're very happy to have Nicole. She's no stranger to this region and to all of the challenges and blessings that we have in the Caribbean. Nicole is being joined and supported by Mahmoud Saeed, an IMF data scientist in the Information Technology Department / Economic Systems. Happy to have you, Mahmoud. And Craig from TripAdvisor, Principal Machine Learning Engineer. So this is the first time that I've had a webinar with a machine learning engineer, or any kind of engineer for that matter. So welcome, Craig, and happy to have you and your expertise join us now for this exciting discussion. So again, thank you. And so I just want to turn it over initially now to Nicole to give us an introduction as to why you decided to do this work. What are the key findings of this research and the index itself? Nicole?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Marla, for inviting us all. And also thanks to Craig for joining from TripAdvisor. So let's just step back a few years. When I was working on Barbados in about 2014, the context was such that then growth was weak in the Caribbean, and tourism growth of the sector was also stalled, and it hadn't recovered after the Great Recession, unlike in a lot of other parts of the world. So we wanted a better understanding about the growth story, about the tourism sector. And in part of our work at the fund is we look at external sustainability, competitiveness, fiscal sustainability, and all of those things are heavily affected in the Caribbean by tourism. So we started really doing a lot of research, and this was a key element. Now, before I talk a little bit about the research, I want to say that the idea of this was to be an internal tool, not really intended as an IMF product. It was to supplement our existing indicators, to use it in research and analysis. And that's still the case, but it turned out there's a lot of interest and demand for it outside. But I just wanted to flag that this is not a perfect tool yet. It's a work in progress. We're continuing to update it, and we welcome feedback and input from people at any time. So this is a great opportunity for that. So the original research in 2014, we were wanting to know what was driving tourism to the Caribbean in particular. And so part of that work, we did some, dynamic panel regressions, looking at all the different variables that affect tourism flows. And that included in particular the supply side, which is, links what's going on in the big markets and how does that affect the flows. And also on the demand side, or sorry, that was demand side. On the supply side in the countries, what were the main issues? Particularly, we're looking at prices. And typically in research, you use the exchange rate for that. But and we found some very interesting findings. But at the same time, I thought, a static measure of what is the costs would be really helpful to inform this research. And so, drawing on the idea of the Big Mac Index, I thought, let's just create one. And so we started out literally by hand, with some research assistance, scraping the internet, and by hand, booking hotels and then recording that and creating a price index. We also use those other websites to get prices on meals and drinks. And that was the genesis of it. We updated it then, since it was very labor intensive, we updated it every quarter, and we started to develop a time series, but it was very, let's just say, awkward and time consuming. Then there was an internal big data push, and we got recognition in that exercise. And then we got the help of the data scientists, which was instrumental in changing and moving it forward. And so that was sort of the evolution. I will say at the original stages, when we created this index, we did a lot of robustness checks. In other words, we did a lot of other manipulations, and we used a lot of other sources to make sure that it was legit, and that it was at least, there was an element of reliability. So for example, we took the UN per diem database, which actually goes back 40 years. And covers the same items: hotel, meals, taxi, and we also took the U.S. State Department per diem, and we did some other things, like we took one hotel chain, for instance, like Marriott or Hilton, and only used those in all of the markets, just to make sure, to the best that we could, to control for quality, things like that, because of course the Big Mac is much simpler. Anyway, the point being that all of these exercises supported the robustness of the original index, and so that was really reassuring. We started out also using Travelocity and Trivago. Won't mention those again, Craig. And that worked well, but luckily, we were able to collaborate with TripAdvisor and shift to working with TripAdvisor, which has a much more comprehensive coverage and just a different set of resources available. So at this point now, I want to shift over to Craig and let him talk a little bit, to Mamoun, talk a little bit about how it works, what you did to go from big data to processing and transforming it into a simple, index.
Thank you, Nicole. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes.
Thank you, Marla, for having us. Initially, when we started this work, when I met Nicole and her colleagues, I realized they were going online manually and typing in searches and downloading data like that. And so at the time, there were some companies such as Expedia and whatnot who were offering application programmers interfaces, programmatic ways to go and download data. So I thought to myself, okay, maybe we could automate this process and make it more user-friendly. And so we went to Expedia website. We wrote some code that would go and download this data and so on. Initially, it worked. But then that website was closed down completely. And that was the biggest learning for us and the biggest experience for us, if you like, where we decided, maybe we should partner with someone and have, a reliable agreement in place, a reliable data source, and so on. So that's where I met with colleagues at TripAdvisor, and they kindly agreed to work with us and help us in this. Now, that's the hotel side, data side. And then other sources we found online. There's a website called Numio, which provides crowdsourced prices for various food items. And so we tapped into that resource, which is also in line with what we're doing with these travel sites, because it's user contributed, in a sense, user contributed information. Finally, the third source we combined was a website called World Cap Fairs, which listed taxi rides from airports to various major cities around the world. Hopefully in the future we can improve that, maybe talk to Uber, talk to those kinds of firms that are changing the market in a sense. And so we took all these sources and we constructed an index number from it. We fully automated the process. We have an agreement in place with colleagues at TripAdvisor, like I said, and we constructed the index. Luckily for us, the results look pretty much the same, and we are able to construct a time series. TripAdvisor has historical data going back, I think, to 2014, which we were able to tap in. And immediately, once we made that available to colleagues at work here, people were very excited. I got lots of very nice feedback. People said they can do some nice modeling, nice type of research work. Yeah.
Okay, so that's I mean, I congratulate you for persevering through the challenges and getting all of that, this whole infrastructure, I guess, if you will, for the index established. So, Nicole, would you be able to share with us, based on the findings of the index, what would you tell us are the major findings of the research on the index itself? You're muted, Nicole.
Sorry. Thank you. Well, what we found early on, and this is relatively unchanged, is that the prices, nominal costs of this in the Caribbean are significantly higher than they are in all other beach destinations, or almost all. And now, if your listeners will see from the handout, the index we have by country, and basically that's each country data point is an average of the samples, the beach destination in that sample. So it's not the whole country, of course. So one country could have 5 beach destinations, and then we average those. So just for that information. But the fact is that the costs in the Caribbean, measured by the index, are significantly higher.
And I just want to interrupt you there for a second to note very specifically that this does not include airfare.
That's correct. That's correct.
That's usually a misconception in the Caribbean, that it's expensive because it's expensive to get here, but this is entirely right.
Yes, that's something we're thinking about, but at this stage we want to really perfect and refine the in-country nominal costs. And so that's, again, hotel, food, drinks, and one taxi ride from the airport. So that was the original finding. That hasn't changed. We now have a database of the index that covers 4 years, and that shows fairly consistent results. In fact, I would say it's either unchanged or maybe it's even gotten higher over those 4 years.
So meaning that the cost of a week in the Caribbean has gotten higher in 2018, let's just say, in some countries versus 2014.
Yeah, I would say that. So we have, so if we have the index from October of this year, which isn't a bad month because it's between seasons, but the price is almost 50% or 30 to 50% more than in other Western hemispheres, so Central America, Mexico, etc. Asia Pacific is still the cheapest. These are averages. These are regional averages, right? So you have to you can play with this. Is one thing that's great about this, and including the data that we've shared with you, you can remove markets from your samples and look at that. So that was the first finding. And as I said at the beginning, this is a price index. We wanted to get a better understanding of what was going on in the sector, and we don't have sector-based deflators. We didn't have that in the Caribbean. Consumer price indices are sometimes not that helpful because they're either the basket weights are not useful, they're too broad. So this was really the goal of that. We didn't necessarily derive direct policy recommendations from this price index. However, it helped to inform our analysis, and including, for example, on external competitiveness, and that indirectly informed our policy advice. For example, into things like integrating, for example, the issues going on in the source markets, diversifying markets to lower vulnerabilities in these countries to the economic cycle in advanced economies. So risk, sort of other methods of risk mitigation in the sector, for instance, more regional coordination amongst the Caribbean so they could enhance the Caribbean brand. On the market issue, we're working a lot now with Asian colleagues in the Asia department. I mean, if you just look at some numbers from China, in 2000, there were 5 million tourists from China. Tourists leaving China to visit. In 2017, there were 135 million. And the growth, expected in that market is even stronger going forward. So there's a lot of scope and potential for growth in the tourism sector, but that's just a data point that is worth considering. So it's not necessarily a non-growth sector, depending on policies taken. So those are the kinds of recommendations we made based on all of our work, and as well information gleaned from this price index. One other point was, and by the way, there's research going on by my colleagues that are working on the Caribbean division. They updated a lot of the research in other areas, and there will be something coming out, I think, at the next Article 4 report on the ECCU, for example. But one area that's always of interest also is how the tourism is affected in the lower cost destinations and the high end destinations. And this is something that we find in our models and in our research, that there is a significant difference in what are the factors that affect arrivals react differently for those markets. So that's intuitive and makes sense, but this index gives you a much better idea of who are those markets, and how can that affect policy, differentiate policy in those countries versus the sort of higher end, more expensive destinations.
Yeah, and actually some of the other work that the IMF has done that I was able to use recently, to your point about what affects arrivals, that showed that actually the accommodation, the availability of accommodation really was not a driving factor, because in the Caribbean, I know that I've heard this argument, build it and they will come. And what the research that you guys did at the IMF showed was that that's actually not the case. And what really drives arrivals more than accommodation is the extent of the airlift, number of seats and frequency of flights and that kind of thing. Is there anything you want to say? I know that this research and the index you didn't really take into account flights, but it did accommodation. Is there anything that comes to mind that you want to add here on that?
No, you're absolutely right. The research showed that it was the number of flights, and not even the number of airlines, but it was the number of flights that had the strongest impact, and that repeatedly in 2 or 3 studies, the actual number of rooms didn't, and even testing for indigeneity and all of those things, it wasn't significant statistically. No, I guess the main takeaways were, if you are a high-end destination, what's critical is making sure that the tourism product meets that. So, making sure from a government's perspective that they invest in infrastructure and in institutions, in the environment, in services, and because that market is less sensitive to price. So that's either the price that's reflected in this index or price that's affected by changes in the exchange rate. But at the lower cost, we found naturally, and it's not surprisingly, that that market was much more sensitive to price. In other words, so the elasticity, like of tourists going to those countries, would be much more affected by change in prices in the market and or the exchange rate. So in those countries, it would be a lot more important to focus on containing costs, because that was the more, so that's labor costs, energy costs, and possibly consideration about exchange rate changes. But we know that in the Caribbean, there are a number of markets that have fixed exchange rates. So, but anyhow, so that was the overall sort of policy advice on that issue.
Thanks. And with respect to the index itself, it just occurred to me that it would be interesting to look at what the price inflation was for each of the markets that you have in the index over time. And so if the inflation rate coming out of the index is, say, higher than your overall inflation rate nationally, then it would suggest that you need to really look at why. And, because these costs that are driving the overall cost for a week on the beach, vacation, it would be, I mean, if I were a policymaker, I would think that I would want to make sure that there isn't something going on that's skewing prices more upwards in the tourism sector than in the rest of the wider economy. But that's just my overall thought here on that.
That's a great idea. I mean, because we just sort of got this relaunched, it was on a hiatus for about a year while we were working with TripAdvisor to, get an agreement and then automate everything. But now that it's up and launched, we do have 4 years of data, and we have, of course, we have the US dollar number, and that converted to an index. And with that US dollar number, we can do exactly, teams could do exactly that. We can, track the change in dollars, compare that with, domestic price changes and US inflation, compare those and see then in real terms, how have prices moved compared to other prices in the domestic and internationally.
Indeed.
So
yeah, I agree. That ought to make for some interesting conversations later on. I just want to give Craig an opportunity to share his thoughts with us. What has it been like working on this index, and is there anything that you want to share with us in terms of your perspective on this?
Well, I mean, we did the easy part. We just gave the data that we had, and so it was really just a matter of aggregating. We get a lot of price quotes every day, so we have this big data warehouse, and so just set up a job that ran over our cluster, aggregating it by like the months you're traveling, the months you're looking at the website, and like the bubble rating that you get and the star rating and so forth. So, and we legally couldn't provide it at the level where it was. You could back out the hotel prices because we get these prices from different providers, but we went it down so basically as long as there were 2 or 3 hotels in the clump that you were computing over, it was okay. So hopefully it's still enough detail that it could build a nice index out of it without. So it's, I'd say, probably one of the best sources you can get for the data. And anyway, so we just have that running every month, and then the IMF gets to do the hard stuff. So.
The exciting stuff.
Yes.
So the one more thing that I wanted to raise, though, is around the fact that in 2014 there were a certain set of countries on the index in the Caribbean, and then we had a few changes in the new one. I mean, most notably, the Cayman Islands fell off in the new iteration. And I know we have some folks from the Cayman Islands on the call, so I thought it might be interesting for them to understand what happened and therefore understand better how you maintain presence and representation in the index. Anybody who wants to answer that can go right ahead.
Sure, I can take that.
Yeah. Okay.
So the way the index is designed is there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between privacy and confidentiality of the data providers, so the hotels, etc., and coverage. And so the first iteration, what we decided to do is to go really, really simple and say, we're going to pick 3 to 4 star bubble rating or star rating, if you like. We're going to assume a lead time of 6 months. And based on that, so the way the data is provided to us is we get a query date, so the time the individual went onto the website to look up quotes, and you have an intended travel date. And so we decided to fix those just to make things very, very simple. And so as a result, your sample will eventually change. So you will have months if there aren't any availability in the 3 to 4 bubble rating, category, then potentially that market will drop off. So the Cayman Islands, for example, if we change the index and have it at a 5-star or 5 bubble rating, we'll come back up, but we will lose other markets as a result. And so this is a trade-off. We're kind of trying to figure out a way to make less severe and have better and more coverage, if you like.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. So yeah, I know that you all didn't get to a point of looking at policy recommendations, but I mean, it's fairly obvious that because we are consistently the highest cost destinations in the region, in the world, and over time maybe even getting much more expensive, to me, it really means that the policymakers in the region have to take a long, hard look at ourselves and our model if we want to grow market share and if we want to improve the outcomes we have in the tourism sector in terms of how much revenue we get. I know there is also this debate in the region about getting more tourists or getting tourists to spend more, the ones that you already get and not getting, because these are small islands in many cases, and having millions of people coming every year is probably not, from an environmental standpoint, very sustainable, except maybe the larger destinations like the Dominican Republic and so on, and Cuba, that they can handle these kinds of volumes. But how to get the more, I suppose, lucrative tourists to come. So yes, that's something that I hope that the policymakers will be prompted to look at, given that you've identified the trends very clearly here in your research. If anybody has anything else to add, we can do that. Otherwise, I think we can turn to the audience for their questions.
Just one other thing that, and I don't know, when we originally put this together, we used the star rating for hotels based on, Expedia, whatever. Yes. But I feel like with TripAdvisor, we have a sort of much more organic and more comprehensive measure with the bubbles, because they're user-based satisfaction and covering a whole range of issues. As you know, if you've ever gone and checked out a hotel, the bubble rating, involves qualitative and quantitative issues. So I just wanted to flag that as a difference, and it's an important aspect.
Should I just maybe explain the difference real quickly? Oh, so the star ratings are a weird thing. They have legal meaning some places, like in France and Italy, the government mandates what the star rating is for a location. So, and for other places, they don't exist. So we get some from Expedia, like you mentioned. We do other sorts of things. So they're kind of like vague and loosey-goosey and not very accurate. So, and also sometimes don't even necessarily, like a 5-star rating implies you have a business center, and some people don't really care if they can go check their email in the lobby. So there's things that are 5-star that are not necessarily important to most travelers. Being very full service. So instead, we mostly use what we call a bubble rating, since we legally can't call it a star. And it's essentially comes down to the average of reviews. We have hundreds and hundreds of millions of reviews, so it aggregates how much the people who are staying there like it, and by doing so, you can find places that aren't necessarily as expensive but are good. 5 stars almost inherently expensive, but there are a lot of 5 bubble places. Often, if the owners are engaging and so forth, that I think people would prefer to stay at.
Yeah, you're right. There is a correlation between stars and price, definitely. Um, and which I found odd because, like, for example, I remember this one time I booked a hotel in New York and it was 4.5 stars. And I kid you not, it was a dump.
Mhm.
And I just was, of course, I paid a lot for it. But, and I just remember thinking, this is not right. So I don't know how they arrive at these stars in that particular entity. But I'm happy to hear that this bubble, it's, I guess, more democratic in the way that it's decided based on feedback from the customers themselves. So that's interesting to look. I'll be sure to consult your bubbles rather than the stars on Expedia going forward. Thank you for that.
Actually, interestingly, if you build a machine learning model, being 5-star is almost always a negative indicator for bookings or revenue or whatever.
Is it?
Yeah, not bubble, but star, because people don't like 5-starness generally.
Oh, really? I always thought that 5-starness kind of gives you a comfort level that where you're going, or 4 or 5-star, that where you're going is, it's going to be clean, it's going to be of a certain standard, etc. I never thought that it would be, from a bubble standpoint, a negative. That's very interesting. I have to look more at your bubbles. But thanks for sharing that. That's an interesting innovation. So I think we can turn over to the audience for questions. So Melissa usually would field questions from the audience for us and feed them to us. It may not necessarily be every single question. If there are questions that are similar, she just would send us that, basically the gist of the question. So Melissa, can we get some questions, please?
Yeah, I'd like to start off with some questions I've gotten for Nicole. And I know that you touched a bit on what affects arrivals. The person writes in that they saw that you had published a paper called Revisiting Tourism Flows in the Caribbean, What's Driving Arrivals. Did you touch on, in that paper or anywhere else, have you touched anywhere on how much the cost of a vacation actually impacts on increasing arrivals? Before I let you answer, Nicole, I also know that you have mentioned some of the research that was in the IMF book, and we did a webinar a few months ago with the IMF on that. And when we did that, we created a download link for that book. So anyone that would like to look at the research, some of the other research that Nicole's talked about, you can go to bit.ly/IMF book. And you can just download that book and look at the chapter on tourism. So that'll give some more information too. You can also see the original version of this index there. So I just wanted to say that. And then Nicole, now I'll let you go ahead and answer the question on how much does the cost of a vacation impact with increasing arrivals.
Nicole, you're muted.
Okay, that original study, one of the objectives of the panel regression was that to estimate the elasticity of arrivals to price. And we used in that study, price was the real effective exchange rate, which is a broad measure as an explanatory variable in the equation. And I think we updated that data 2 years ago. We updated that estimate. And also, I think, as I mentioned, that the team working on ECCU is working on that right now also. And I think it's changed the elasticity, which means how much a change in the exchange rate, which indirectly affects the price, affects tourism flows. And so we did do that in that paper. And when we updated 2 years ago, it hadn't changed much. It had, I think the coefficient had increased. In other words, there was a stronger impact from change in the cost, the average cost based on changes in the exchange rate. Now though, we could update that estimate, and instead of using the real exchange rate that's deflated by CPI inflation, we can estimate it using a real exchange rate deflated by the week at the beach index, which might give more robust results or different results. Basically, what we did find that I can give you just some. What we found was going back to the original the original research was that, for example, a 1% appreciation of the exchange rate, so you can say indirectly a 1% appreciation in increase in the cost of your holiday, would lead to a decrease in arrivals by 0.16%, so about roughly 20%. And that was that's an estimate that we had. As I said, we've updated it, and we can share those more recent estimates with you. The one thing we did find in that research, though, was that when we split the sample into low end and high end, that was at the time based on stars versus 2 to 3 star hotels versus 5 star, we found that there was no impact of price changes for the high end, the 5 star destinations. I think there were 5 or 6, so it's a small sample, but there was no, the impact of the exchange rate changes was not statistically significant. So, which, as I said earlier, is intuitive, but it would be interesting to review and update these estimates using this index instead of the broader CPI indices.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Nicole, we have gotten some questions in about policies, and I want to start off with the food and beverage, the impact of food and beverage costs on the indicator. And I've had a few people write in that the taxes placed on alcohol could be hurting the tourism sector. At least that's a perception, and it would be interesting to see some evidence around this. Is this something that the index approaches in some way? For example, what impact the import tax on wines and spirits could be having on the cost of an overall vacation? Is that something that's included in the index?
We're
hearing
you. Do you have? Oh yeah, Mamoun, do you have anything you want to say on the prices that are drawn before I answer that?
No, I think we don't tease out taxes. That's something that could be very interesting down the road, but right now we don't, and so we're not able to.
So I think maybe what might be more important to ask is not the taxes themselves, but in the overall cost of a week on the beach, what's the weighting of alcoholic beverages, basically? Can you tell us?
So we assume we have a formula where we assume we have a 7-day holiday. In that 7-day, you will have 1 inexpensive meal and 2 kind of more expensive meals, and we assume that you would have a beer every day. So it's
only one alcoholic beverage.
One alcoholic
Right.
beverage. So we have 7 beers for the I'm sure people will have more than that, but
yeah,
it's kind of,
no,
again,
of course.
it's a simplifying assumption, and
Of course.
it's something we can defend.
So that no, and to your point, if it's only 1 alcoholic beverage a day, then one would argue that the impact of a tax or an increase in tax on alcoholic beverages will not really move the index too much based on the way it's structured already. Sorry, Nicole, I'm sorry for cutting you.
No, it's fine. That's fine. Go ahead, Mamoun.
That's I don't have anything else to add on that.
Oh, okay, fine. No, so yeah, I think he's answered the question, and you've answered the question. I mean, this price index is, and as Mamoun said, the importance is that the approach is consistent, applied to all the markets. So that's the first thing. But it's an imperfect measure because it does not account for differences in administered fees, in taxes, and it can't absorb the impact of the costs of other things, that non-tradable goods, for example, property prices, or it's just, it's taking the blunt, user-based price. And so it doesn't absorb, or it can't differentiate, or at least it could, but it doesn't, as it's constructed now, it doesn't, disaggregate costs related to taxes, etc.
Right, and so the answer to the question from the audience is that tax that they're asking, could that be one of the factors that's driving the costs? Based on the way your index is structured, it will not have a significant
No, I don't think so.
Exactly. Next question.
What specific policies do you think that this index could be used to evaluate, to reevaluate, or restructure?
Well, one, it could provide more information to make an assessment on exchange rate valuations. It shouldn't be the only. There should be many other elements that we use, that we look at, including the consumer price index, including other things that you look at when you're analyzing whether an economy's external sector is healthy or sustainable, including things like market share, unit labor costs, changes in labor costs relative to competitors, as well as price changes. So all of these things, it can be a useful tool in that more comprehensive analysis. You know, it's as I mentioned at the start, it's really, that's what it should be considered as one more tool in this, in the more complex work that we do in terms of assessing competitiveness, external competitiveness, external sustainability, exchange rate valuations, etc.
I've gotten a few questions on the competitiveness point, and looking country to country, if you compare one country to another, what sort of insights would you say, or have you been able to find any specific insights into competitiveness of one country versus another through the values that you've generated in this index over the last few years?
I think other than, you know, I think within a region, if you look at the Caribbean grouping, and I'm looking for the chart in front of me, you might get some surprises, you know, in terms of things that you assumed or you thought of a market that was at the average or was actually less expensive, and it turns out, based on this consistent application of method and extracting data from all the same sources, that in fact it's less expensive, or I mean, it's more useful that way, possibly for policymakers specifically in the region, to see where they fit relative to other countries in the region and also other countries around the world, and then to go from there and use that information to see, well, they could drill down and find out, you know, for example, do we have a tax rate on meals that is a VAT or whatever, or, you know, that is significantly different from other countries, or what are our labor costs relative to, you know, is that contributing to? So I think it's just sort of take this as a starting point, and do your individual analysis, or even on a regional basis, and go from there.
I just wanted to add, could I just add that, you know, you're right, Nicole, and I think that labor and energy costs are probably the highest in the region for this sector in particular. I mean, of course, the cost of importing food and alcohol would be a factor, but, you know, it is, to me, for this reason and others, imperative that we look more at renewable energy in this region. And I know that there are some governments that have incentivized a switch to renewable by, for example, removing customs duties on the renewable energy generating equipment. I know that there are hotels in Barbados, for example, that have been installing more solar panels and so on to switch. And I think that insofar as governments are keen to support this sector, which they should be in this region, that's one of the key, for me, policy implications of this research. We really need to drive costs down. And so, you know, incentivizing a switch to renewables, I think, is a good start. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that's interesting, and I haven't looked at it recently, but when we originally did this, there was a high correlation with proximity to the US market and cost. So those island markets that were closer to the US were higher costs. It was actually a fairly robust. I mean, how do you explain that? I don't know, maybe over time, you know, that was a competitive advantage that was eroded by markets You know, it's something that could be analyzed further and could be used by those markets, for instance, Bahamas, more, you know, as a more serious input into policy making or decision making on costs.
Indeed.
I've had a few questions too, and I know that Craig touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth going back to for just a minute because there's still some questions out there. We talked specifically, for example, about the case of the Cayman Islands that was on the index in the 2014 version, and it's not on the index right now. Craig talked and Mamoun talked about a little bit about why that is and how some destinations, depending on the number of hotels available, might not be available on the index. But there's still some questions about, you know, in terms, for example, with the case of Cayman Islands, that there are similar destinations from the standpoint of luxury offerings, could be Bermuda or Turks and Caicos, that are included. So, you know, what would be differentiating this from the standpoint of whether it's included or not? If you could just give some more information about this, so that those countries that are not included could perhaps find a way even to benchmark against some that are, that would be, I think, very useful.
Mamoun?
Well, we just started with a list of destinations that came from the IMF, and haven't changed any of that. We could certainly include other places that, but the limitation being that there have to be enough hotels that would be in a certain bucket of for a given travel month for it to show up with as not being anonymized.
I know there's a few people on this call that if you have back data and that were included would probably be jumping up and down and be very, very excited.
If I may add to what Craig said, I guess the key thing here is the trade-off. So, you know, we took a simplicity route, but there's nothing stopping us from, you know, there's nothing stopping anyone from like building 5 different indexes, you know, one for each category and so on. However, we just chose to go down the simple route. And also the fact that we want to preserve the privacy of our of the hotels, that guarantees, that is one of the guarantees that we would keep getting this data. You know, if we can't do that, then that might kind of cut the pipeline, if you like. And yeah, unfortunately, because of those kinds of constraints, maybe, you know, some locations over time can change slightly. Like Craig said, we could go back and revisit the samples, but I would say some destinations won't have that many hotels by design, I guess, and so those might be kind of left out, or unfortunately left out.
The other question that I've gotten a lot is about the research that's potentially been done on flights and flight prices, because Marla, that's something Marla mentioned earlier in the call as well, and we know that that's not included in the index. So is there anything, Nicole, that you've seen that the IMF has produced regarding how the price of flights impacts arrivals, or what the price of flights is comparing one destination to another?
Well, we did the one paper on what aspects of airlift are important for arrivals and growth in the tourism sector. It was not based on price though, but we are thinking about, if possible, you know, going forward, also either expanding this index or creating a parallel one that would include air travel. But we would have to pick, you know, for example, one. So for the Caribbean, we would have to pick one. I'm not sure how we would do it yet, but we could pick one starting point, Miami, or I don't know what. And it would probably then only be able to focus it on one region, because I don't know what you would do for Asia. Would you pick Hong Kong or Singapore as a starting point? So there's that issue. But I mean, that's a possibility. We haven't, to answer the question though, we haven't, to my knowledge, we haven't done research specifically on the price of air travel and how it affects tourism flows. There is work going on particular for our member governments in the region who are very interested in this, on changes in taxation of airfare by the Caribbean governments and how much that will affect the arrivals and the market. And now, actually, I'm working with somebody here, and I'm hoping to work more with Mamoun on this, by big data, because we have the problem with this is, believe it or not, there's very, very limited data. We cannot collect data from the authorities on how they tax airlines, and how we have some, but it's very limited. And also, we don't have any time series. So we need a time. We need to know what was taxation like over the last 20 years to be able to estimate how it's affected, or if it has affected travel. So what we can do now, though, with big data is go to, you go to like a TripAdvisor or somewhere, and you search for a cheap flight. And then when you get to that flight, you actually go to the airline and you book it. And right before you pay, for most airlines, you get a great breakdown of the taxes.
Yes. Yes.
And that is really going to be the best way we can get that information from a public finance standpoint. And that's my next project.
Great.
I just booked a flight, for example, from Washington to Montreal. And Canada is, it has fairly high taxes if you're flying out from outside. And the taxes and all fees included were 138% of the actual air cost. So I don't know what it is in the Caribbean, but I'm sure it's not that high, but that's a big issue.
Well, yeah, we did some research ourselves for a recent presentation that's on my website that we did at the Cayman Islands.
Oh, yes.
And,
yes.
Yeah, and there were some jurisdictions where the taxes were 100% or more than 100% of the cost that the airline imposed. So there are some that fall into that category of Montreal that you just mentioned, but there are others that it's much cheaper as well. So there's a huge disparity in the Caribbean in terms of the application of taxes.
I'm sorry, Marla. Actually, that's where I got the idea from you.
Yeah.
I got so excited when I actually, and it's a great idea. And I think that, I'm gonna get back in touch with you, but if we can do this in the same approach that we've done the Week at the Beach Index, by basically just getting reliable data, at least in real time, on the taxation of airfare, that could be very useful for policymakers.
Yeah, and the thing is, what I found is that if you have this huge disparity, though, you have some countries that are charging 100% or more than 100% of the airline's cost, and then you have those that are charging much less. That huge disparity in the Caribbean, then that does not explain why we have the highest cost in the world. Of your cost does not include airfare, but airfare plus your cost then would mean that's still the highest in the world. And so it's deeper, it's way deeper than airfare and airline costs and taxes imposed. But I'm sure the taxes don't help, because the implication is that it's a deterrent to people coming. And if you want to have more people come, or people who come that can spend more, or both, then taxing them and penalizing and discouraging them from coming is not going to help. But anyway, I suppose there must be a way that we can work out the elasticity, and I guess it would vary amongst certain jurisdictions, the elasticity of price demand based on the taxes being adjusted. Yeah.
No, I think it's a combination of everything, but I think the bottom line is that there's a much higher cost structure in the Caribbean, both for overhead and for variable costs, particularly labor. And there's a much higher, on average, a much higher per capita income, the standard of living. So these are all issues. But I think as you flagged, all issues need to be addressed, including taxation.
Yeah, there is a higher per capita income. Standard of living, I'm not so sure. We have to debate that on another webinar, though.
Okay, sorry. Per capita income.
Yeah, per capita income. But I think we can probably wrap up here, because I don't want to run over an hour. And I just want to thank you, Nicole, Mahmoud, and Craig, this is, I mean, you might not have thought of it when you first started creating and updating this index, which was for internal consumption initially, as you pointed out, Nicole. You might not have thought of how this would impact policymaking in this region. But I think, given that it's the only credible source of comparative data, comparative across time and comparative across jurisdictions in the region, but also worldwide, I can see that there are tremendous policy implications for this work. I congratulate you for doing it. I congratulate you and thank you for finding the time to come on this webinar to share your thoughts with us on why you did it, how you did it. And I'm keen to support this kind of work and the work that you're doing on helping the Caribbean find its way better. So happy to support by sharing more information with my readers and followers and so on. And also, if there is anything that I can do to help decide how to make it better, I'm happy to do that. And I thank all of you, and I appreciate your time. And I know that we will get some good feedback from the audience. I want to thank the audience as well for coming and attending and asking questions and sticking with us for the hour. And the next time you upgrade your index to include other variables like airfare and otherwise, we'll be happy to have another webinar to discuss it.
Well, Marla, thank you so much for this opportunity. I should just say a couple. We hope to have a external web page that would just have a simple update of this every month or quarter. Mm-hmm. So it would just have the charts and the simple index. Mm-hmm. And that's the first thing, but I'm working on that. So that could be useful for your people, your audience, but hopefully also for our members. The other thing is that the beauty of this sort of more automated index that we have now working with TripAdvisor is that we have applications that can add a lot of flexibility. So when we're reviewing it, we can change the sample countries, yes. We can change the types of hotels, mm-hmm. Resorts to include or not. We can change the lead time. For instance, we have it set up now at a 6-month. So we can play with it and try to improve it or tailor it to the needs of like the analysis that we're doing. Mm-hmm. So that could change over time too, but we will try to stick with the sort of flagship one that we have. But if people have a specific, like it sounds like you have a market that has a specific interest, Cayman Islands, we will take another look at that and see how we can accommodate. Of course, that's not our first priority is to the IMF member governments, but that's still very useful information for them. So maybe we could find a way to include it, or maybe we can do once a year an edition of like the 5 bubble. Assuming, let's say, that market doesn't have a confidentiality issue and there are enough hotels that don't breach that, then maybe we can do a version with, right, Mamoon? We can do a 5 bubble version. Yeah, and then that would give you a snapshot of how that market compares to all the rest. So Marla, you could get in touch with me if you have any specific.
I think so. I think we'll do that. Take it offline. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mamoon. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
And of course, Nicole.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.